Hi, I'm Dr. Zach Breitenbach with K-Pole and Contact Mission. Moral arguments for God's existence have a long history, and there are many insightful types of moral arguments. Today I'm offering you a nuanced version of William Lane Craig's well-known moral argument that takes into account recent critiques that have been offered by David Baggett, a Christian philosopher who's known for his excellent work in moral apologetics. For an in-depth clarification of the distinction between my way of structuring and defending the argument and Craig's approach, and how I take into account Baggett's critiques, you may reference my 2020 article in the Irish Theological Quarterly that is titled "A Proposal to Augment the Plausibility of William Lane Craig's Deductive Moral Argument." So let's get into the argument. I will first state the argument, define some of its key terms, and show how it is logically valid. Then I will explain how I would recommend defending the argument's premises. My way of stating the argument is as follows. Premise 1. If a world lacks God, then there would be no objective moral values and duties in that world, since there would be no adequate source or foundation for it. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties exist in the actual world. Conclusion. Therefore, it is not the case that the actual world lacks God, thus God exists. Let's first define some key terms to make sure you understand the argument. A world is just a total description of reality. In philosophy, speaking of different worlds involves speaking of different ways for reality to be. Of course, reality is only one way, the actual world. But we can talk about other worlds, other ways of conceiving reality to be. And any change in the way reality is, even a small one, constitutes a different world. For example, a world that is exactly like the actual world up to this present moment, but I put on blue socks instead of continuing to wear the ones that I'm now wearing, would constitute a different world than the actual world. Note that just because we can speak of or conceive of certain worlds, such as a world in which God does not exist, that does not mean that all such worlds are really possible. If God exists, then He is a necessary being and exists in all possible worlds. That is, any way that reality could be would have to include God. So just because premise 1 speaks about a world lacking God, that does not mean that such a world is actually possible. So premise 1 is not speaking about reality as it actually is, and it is not saying anything about whether a world without God is possible. Rather, it is strictly theoretical. It is merely claiming that God must be the foundation of objective moral values and duties. So any description of reality that lacks God must also lack objective moral values and duties. So what does objective mean, and what are moral values and duties? Objective means true regardless of what any human thinks about it. For example, it is an objective fact that the Earth is a globe. By contrast, something that is subjective depends on people's opinions and can vary from person to person. For example, chocolate tastes good. Now let's define moral values and duties. Moral value has to do with whether something is good or bad. For example, love and justice are good, hatred and injustice are bad. Moral duties are moral obligations or prohibitions. What's right or wrong? What's morally required? So let's clarify what each premise of our moral argument is saying. Premise 1 is saying that in any description of reality that doesn't include God, there could be no moral good or bad and right or wrong that rises above subjective preference. There could be no universal moral truth that is binding regardless of opinion. Premise 2 is saying that in the way reality actually is, some things are morally good or bad regardless of what any human thinks. Moreover, we have real moral responsibilities that exist regardless of human opinion. Now that we have defined key terms and understood the key premises, let's make sure we're clear on how the conclusion follows logically from the premises by a simple rule of logic called modus tollens. This rule of logic follows this format. 1. If P is true, then Q is true. 2. Q is not true. 3. Therefore P is not true. Our moral argument follows this rule of logic. If P, a world lacks God, then Q, that world lacks objective moral values and duties. But in the actual world, Q is not true. There are objective moral values and duties. So in the actual world, P is not true. It is not the case that the actual world lacks God. Thus, God exists. So, since this is a logically valid deductive argument, if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then the conclusion logically has to be true. So why think that they are true? Let's start with premise 2. It's hard to deny that some things are objectively right and wrong. Our unavoidable moral criticism shows we believe in objective morality. As C.S. Lewis points out in the opening of Mere Christianity, we all recognize that there is an objective moral law and expect others to do likewise. Rejecting premise 2 requires accepting that there is nothing objectively wrong with things like Nazis starving, torturing, and murdering Jews, or terrorists flying planes into buildings, or a man molesting and torturing a child for fun. Are such things just matters of personal preference? Our moral experience tells us that morality is not the sort of thing that reduces to personal opinion. At least some things are clearly right and wrong. Surely anyone who thinks that torturing a person for fun is morally acceptable is mistaken about an objective truth. This is not a matter of subjective opinion like one's preferred ice cream flavor. If you think that Mother Teresa lived an objectively better life than, say, Hitler, then making this comparison means that you are recognizing an objective moral standard. Ultimately, we simply do not experience morality as a purely subjective matter in which one person's opinion is just as valid as the next person's on any moral issue, and there's no objective truth about any moral issue. So premise 2 is hard to deny, but what about premise 1? I defend this premise by identifying 5 key criteria that any adequate foundation for objective moral values and duties seemingly must possess, and showing that while God meets these criteria, there does not appear to be anything that could meet them in a world that lacks God. Again, this premise is conceptual or theoretical and is not focused on the actual world. Premise 1 answers this question. In any complete description of reality, what sort of thing must be part of that description in order to serve as the standard of objective morality? That is, in order to provide a foundation for objective moral truth. I contend that the standard or foundation of objective morality must meet the following criteria, and that nothing in an atheistic world would meet these criteria. 1. Personal. Morality is an aspect of persons, not impersonal things. Persons are moral agents and take morally significant action, so it would seem bizarre for the foundation of objective moral goodness to be impersonal. And surely an impersonal reality could not establish moral duties or hold persons accountable for upholding them. 2. Transcendent or beyond humanity. The standard must be beyond humanity, as objective means beyond human opinion. Objective morality must come from a reality that is beyond humanity if moral truth rises above subjective human opinion. 3. Unchanging. Surely the source and standard of objective morality couldn't be changing or in flux. What is objectively good or bad and right or wrong today can't change tomorrow. 4. Necessarily good. The standard must not merely be contingently good or good in virtue of something else. It must be necessarily good, and it must be good in itself. It must be the good, the standard by which anything else can be called good by comparison. If the standard were not necessarily good, it would not be a good candidate to place moral duties upon us, for it would be arbitrary and could have been different than what it is. 5. Eternal. If at least some moral truths are necessary truths, then it seems important that the foundation for these truths is eternal. Necessary truths must be eternally true. All 5 of these criteria are attributes of God, but atheism has nothing like this. A being like God seems to be required if there is to be a standard of objective morality. So premise 1 seems correct. If any adequate foundation of objective morality must meet these criteria, and nothing like this seems to exist in any description of reality that lacks God, then God is needed for objective morality. Since objective morality seems to be a feature of the actual world, God must exist in the actual world. The conclusion is logically guaranteed if the premises are true. So that, in a nutshell, is how I recommend defending Craig's moral argument in light of recent critiques by David Baggett and others. I hope you find this approach to be helpful. For K-Pole and Contact Mission, I'm Zach Brighton.